Meanwhile, former Homeland Security advisor to George W. Bush, Fran Townsend, now joins us. And Fran, lots to get here to here. But let's begin, first of all, with responsibility, which is an interesting thing here, because Turkish officials were relatively quick to say that they believe this was an attack by the Islamic State, though ISIS has not claimed any responsibility, something it has proven to not be so shy about in the past. What to make of that?
Well, you know, it was not only the Turkish, right? So anonymous American intelligence officials have said they believe indications are it's ISIS. What it suggests, Josh, is that there's some intelligence that has not been released yet, right? Whether they've identified one of the suicide bombers or they have other intelligence. They clearly also knew this was coming, right?
With regard to this travel warning that they'd issued.
That's right. They had increased the travel warning regarding Turkey. There's been a number of travel warnings throughout Western Europe, and they're going into the Euro Games 2016. And so clearly there's been a drumbeat of increasing intelligence about attacks in Europe. And so I suspect that there's more that we don't know yet.
Is it also perhaps a question that the Islamic State has been allowed something of free reign in Turkey? It has been, if nothing else, it's been a de facto transit hub for ISIS in and out of Syria and the Middle East.
Absolutely.
Might ISIS then not look to take official responsibility again for an attack that now happens on Turkish soil?
Oh, I think absolutely, right. They've used it for the transit, as you point out, of foreign fighters, recruits in, foreign fighters out, commerce, oil revenue. I mean, for a whole bunch of reasons, there's been this sort of unspoken permission that allows ISIS to operate across that border. But I will tell you, you know, having looked back, Saudi Arabia went through this until 2003 when al-Qaeda inside their border started blowing things up, and Saudi Arabia became one of our strongest counterterrorism partners. You know, we like to say you can't keep a snake in your backyard and only expect it to bite your neighbors. And so here's Turkey now experiencing kind of the consequences of this permissive environment that they've allowed.
We also are looking for possible, if not connections, ways to advance the investigation based on what we saw in Brussels and based on what we saw in Paris. In those attacks, we did eventually learn that there was a network more extensive than perhaps just the attackers in question at the airport. Is there a sense that perhaps that is present again?
Well, we should point out today is the 2-year anniversary of al-Baghdadi announcing the caliphate. And there was a graphic put out by ISIS. At the very bottom of the graphic, it shows we have covert units in the following countries. Turkey is one of them. And so we ought to assume this is not sort of 3 guys who got together and did this without more of an infrastructure and support. Look, they have almost, 3 million refugees, not of all of whom they've even been able to register. And so we don't know that whether or not these were refugees, but we certainly know ISIS has been able to transit there and probably has more than just these 3 individuals inside Turkey.
We heard John Kerry. I don't want to play the whole bit of sound because I want the time to discuss it, but we heard the Secretary of State say essentially this is more evidence that ISIS is in fact losing the battle, that they are now having to turn to target-rich, soft targets such as airports. That could be one way to look at this. But another way, and however depressingly and horrifically, it would seem that this is in fact the new front line of any war on terror.
I think that's exactly right. Look, the administration, the coalition, has made some gains in Ramadi and Fallujah. They've not yet been successful in terms of Mosul. And so there have been some small territorial gains in Iraq and Syria. But look, just yesterday, the Philippine defense minister said the rise of extremism in South Asia is a greater threat than the South China Sea conflict. I mean, this is a pervasive and spreading movement, if you will. And so it's not just about the gains in Iraq and Syria. There is some truth, I think, as you put pressure on them in the caliphate, which is sort of the foundation stone of the movement. They're likely to project power elsewhere to prove that they still have muscle and they can still inflict harm. No question. I think what you're going to see after Brussels and Paris and now this attack is more attacks against soft targets. They're more difficult to prevent, they're more difficult to anticipate, and it causes the very thing that ISIS wants, which is to create fear in the minds of civilians.
Juan Zarate, your former deputy, in fact, has said, in fact, that perhaps gone are the days of the grand strike. Perhaps there's no longer an emphasis on flying airplanes into buildings, so much as perhaps dirtier attacks at softer targets. But with regard to airports, get you ahead of here on this one. Is there really anything that we can do? Don't people have to line up at some point?
Yeah, so I would say to you, let's remember, ISIS did bring down a plane over the Sinai, so they're going to not give up on the big attack, the taking a plane and blowing it up and having it fall to the ground. But they're going to be opportunistic, and these soft targets really do present, they're opportunistic, and they create fear and panic, and they get them recruits, they get them press, we're talking about it.
Yep.
So it serves their purpose. I do think, in many respects, because it's easy from their perspective, it takes a couple of guys and a couple of guns and some explosives, that we're likely to see more of these. There are some things we can do. So like the Israelis in U.S. airports, we have people in pre-screening areas that you don't see, that some are in uniform, some aren't. They're trained behavioral analysts, and so there is some ability, but it's an imperfect system, and they're more likely to be successful in that environment than we are.
Yeah, you mentioned if you've not flown into Ben Gurion Airport in Israel, it is something else entirely. Fran, really appreciate the insights
Great
today.
to be here. Thank you.